Your objective for lesson 4 is I will solve 1 and 2-step problems involving graphs. So we've already solved some problems with the other graphs that we've worked on, so this won't be very different. But notice that it says 1 and 2-step problems. Sometimes those 2-step problems get in the way and they're a little tricky, so you've got to make sure that you're reading really closely at these 2-step problems and what it's asking you to do for the graph. Okay, so you have a template in your binder that looks like this. It's just some grid paper that we're going to use to make a graph. And we are going to create a bar graph from this data right here in this chart. You don't have this chart in your binder, so you're going to need to look at this one on the paper. But the first thing that we have to do when we're creating a bar graph that's completely blank is we need to figure out what kind of scale we're going to use. And I'm just going to do with you, and we're going to put our scale on this left-hand side of the paper, so that means that our bars are going to be going up and down, so this is going to be a vertical bar graph. But when we look at the table, we know that we've got different insects, and we've got the number of wing vibrations each second. So we've got a honeybee, a beetle, a fly, a mosquito, and we're looking at their wing vibrations each second. So for the honeybee, it has 350 wing vibrations each second. The beetle has 200, the fly has 550, and the mosquito has 700. So these are really large numbers that we're looking at. So when we have really large numbers, you've got to think what would be the best scale to use for this bar graph. So I want you to think about that. And what kind of scale are you going to be putting on your paper, so that way if somebody's reading this bar graph, they will be able to know actually what those bars represent whenever they're looking at it. So in this case, using hundreds is a strong choice since the numbers are between 200 and 700. If we counted by 20s, we would probably have a very long scale, because it would take us a while to get from 200 to 700. And we're going to start like we always have, and we're going to start at the bottom by labeling that 0. And then since we're counting by hundreds, the next line would be 100. Then the next line would be 200, and then you're going to keep going up to the very last line of your paper. So go ahead and label your scale counting by hundreds, and when you're ready to move on, push play. Okay, so your scale should be going from 0 to 800. And as you can see on my page, I went ahead and labeled some bars, or, like directly in the boxes, where we're going to have mosquito, honeybee, fly, and beetle. I put mine sideways so that way I knew that this part of the bar graph would just be mosquito. Because if I turn mosquito the other way, it's kind of in between all 3 of these bar graphs. That's why sometimes it's easier to write the word sideways, so that way whoever's looking at your graph knows that just this part is going to be for mosquito. So if you want to get the insects written on this side of your bar graph, do that now and push play when you're ready to move on. So we have to think of the labels that we're going to use. So when you're looking at the numbers on our scale and you're looking at the chart, then we will be able to know what to label our numbers, because the chart kind of tells us what the numbers stand for. And we know that the numbers stand for the vibrations per second, and you could even put wing vibrations per second, because that's exactly what we're looking at. So make sure that on your paper you're labeling what these numbers on the scale stand for. We know that the mosquito and the honeybee and the fly and beetle, based on the chart, are insects. So we're going to label that down at the bottom. It's an insect. And then all we need to do now is put the title of our graph. And we know that we're looking at insect wing vibrations. So that's what our title for our graph is going to be. I just always want you to keep in mind, because you may see this on a test. You'll probably see it on the K-Prep, and there's probably going to be a time where you're actually going to have to make your own bar graph, and you're going to have to put all the labels. So just don't forget that you have to have all of these labels on a bar graph whenever you're making your own bar graph. So it says the number of wing vibrations for the honeybee is 350 each second. So when we're making our bar for the honeybee, how are we going to make that bar since we're counting by hundreds here? Well, you know that when you come halfway between 100 and 200, that you have 150. If you're going halfway between 200 and 300, you have 250. And if you're going halfway between 300 and 400, you have 350. So right here where our bar is for honeybee, we just need to make our bar go halfway between 300 and 400, and that's going to show us that the honeybee is 350 seconds, or 350 vibrations each second. So now our next insect on the chart is a beetle. The beetle is exactly at 200. So on your bar graph, you're going to make your bar for the beetle go all the way up to 200, and you're going to lightly shade that in. And then you're going to look at the chart, and you're going to make your bar for the mosquito and the fly. So go ahead and get that on your paper, and whenever you're ready to move on, you can push play. Okay, so your graph should look very similar to mine if you wrote the mosquito, honeybee, fly, and beetle in the same order that I did. The only other bar that was in the middle of two numbers was the fly, because that was 550, and we know that 550 comes between 500 and 600. Okay, so this is the same graph, it just looks a little different because I took a different picture of one. So it's the same one that we've been looking at. On your paper, the one that has the template on it that you've been drawing your graph on, I want you to write a number sentence to find the total number of vibrations two beetles and a honeybee can produce each second. So you're going to be taking what the beetle has, and you're going to be doing that 2 times, and then you're going to have to add that with the honeybees to see how many vibrations they can make each second. So get that number sentence written on your paper, and whenever you're ready to check that answer, I want you to push play. Okay, so the beetle, or I'm sorry, not the beetle, but the honeybee was 350, and the beetle 2 times is 200 and 200. I know that whenever I have 200 and 200, that gives me 400, and 400 and 350 are easy to add together because I know that 50 with these two zeros would give me 50, and I know that 3 and 4 give me 7, so that gives me 750. So the amount of vibrations that happen each second with a honeybee and 2 beetles is 750 winged vibrations. The next question says, compare how many more vibrations a fly and honeybee combined produce than mosquito. You're going to see this word right here a lot when we're working with bar graphs, especially when you have to answer those 2-step problems. When you see the word combined, that means that you're going to have to take 2 of the things, whatever there is that we're talking about based on the graph, and you're going to have to put them together before you add it or subtract it with another number. It's been a while, but we know that these 3 words, how many more, you should automatically be thinking of subtraction. Those are key words that make us think of subtraction. So we know that we're going to have to add and we're going to have to subtract in this problem because of the keywords that we see for combined and how many more. So the first step that we're going to have to do before we subtract is we're going to have to combine the fly and the honeybee vibrations before we subtract those from the mosquito. So you're going to have 2 different number sentences that you're writing on your paper. You're going to have to combine the fly and the honeybee, and then you're going to have to subtract that from the mosquito. So I want you to get those 2 number equations written on your paper, and whenever you're ready to check your answer, you can push play. Okay, so the first number sentence, you had to combine the fly and the honeybee. The fly had 550 wing vibrations, and the honeybee had 350 wing vibrations. And when you add 550 with 350, you get 900. So then you had to take those 900 wing vibrations and you had to subtract them from the mosquito to see how many more the fly and the honeybee made the mosquito. So we got that answer was 200. So when we're comparing how many more there were between the fly and honeybee and the mosquito, the fly and honeybee made 200 more wing vibrations per second than the mosquito did altogether. The next part is you're going to take a look at your bar graph and you're going to come up with another question. When you're coming up with a question for a graph, you got to look at a bar. Pick a bar and then compare it to another bar. Like for example, I don't want you to use this one, but for example, I could say how many wing vibrations did the fly and the beetle make all together? That's just a question. They have to add them together and they get their answer and answer it. So Find a bar, compare it with another bar on the graph, or an insect and compare it to another insect, and then come up with your question. You can be adding, you can be subtracting, and get that question written on your paper, and I'm going to check that question whenever you bring me your exit ticket, and make sure that you're solving your question as well and putting down the answer. So now we're going to be ready to move on to the exit, or not the exit ticket, but the problem set. So if you want to push pause and get that ready, you can do that now. Okay, so we've got a chart and it says that it shows the number of magazines sold by each student. So at the top we've got the students, and over here on the side we've got how many magazines were sold. So we're going to be using what this chart says to draw our own graph, just like what we did in the concept development. And it says that you will have to choose an appropriate scale. So when we look at these numbers, it's going to be really similar to how we looked at it on the concept development. All these numbers are in the hundreds, so we're thinking probably that we need to be skip counting by hundreds on this bar graph, because we know that in between each hundred it would be a 50. So we're going to start by labeling our scale. And, well, actually, our scale is already labeled, so we're going to start by putting our numbers on our scale. Okay, so I know that there's not a little line for it down here at the bottom, but this is where your zero is going to go. And then we're going to put 100, and then we're going to keep counting by hundreds until we get all of our numbers written to the top line. And one thing that you want to double check is your top line should be right at your highest number on the chart, or it should be more than the highest number at the chart, because you want to have enough room left for the bars in case you need them. So when I'm looking at the chart, I see that my highest number is 600, and so the highest number on my scale is also 600. Okay, so one thing that's different about this graph on your paper than the ones that we've worked with is we don't see all of those different squares. It's not like a grid. Whenever you've got the grid paper, it's a lot easier to draw a bar graph because you've got all of those squares to help you draw it exact. So this one, you just have to be careful whenever you're drawing it to be really nice and neat so that the bars, whoever's reading this bar graph, will be able to tell what each bar represents. So now that we've labeled and put the scale, down here at the bottom, we know that we're going to have the students. So we know that our first student was Ben. So you're going to write Ben on the paper, and you're going to leave some space and move on to the next student, which was Rachel. And then you're going to continue doing that and leave some spaces in between each student so you can have the bars. And you're going to list all of the students down here on the bottom part of your bar graph. So get the students written down and then push play whenever you're ready to start drawing your bars. Okay, so your bar graph should look very similar to mine. We've got Ben, Rachel, Jeff, Stanley, and Debbie. And so now we need to start putting our bars for each individual student. So we know that Ben had sold a total of 300 magazines, so my bar is going to go right up here to 300. Rachel sold 250, so it's going to be right in between 200 and 300. And then Jeff sold 100, so it's kind of going to be a short bar. It's going to go right over here to 100. Stanley sold 450, so it's going to be right here in between 400 and 500. So I'm going to look right here on the bar graph, and I'm just going to make my pencil on my screen go all the way over there. And then Debbie sold 600, so I know it's going to be right here at the top mark on the bar graph. And there I have all of my bars, and I'm just going to shade it in, and you can shade it in on yours as well. So your bar graph should look very similar to what mine looks like on the screen. So if you need to get that ready and push pause, you can, because we've got some questions to ask based on this bar graph, or we have questions to answer. Okay, so explain why you chose the scale for your graph. Well, the reason that we chose the scale is because the numbers in the chart were between 100 and 600. It's really hard to, like I said before, count by fives or tens or 20s whenever you've got such large numbers. So it was because they were between 100 and 600. How many fewer magazines did Debbie sell than Ben and Stanley combined? So here's that word combined again, and I know it doesn't say how many more, it says how many fewer, but we're still going to be working with that same type of problem that we did on the concept development. So we're going to have two different equations that we're going to write for part C, you also need to answer part C in a complete sentence. So we've got to combine Ben and Stanley. I know that looking up here at the chart, Ben was 300 and Stanley was 450. So on your paper, you're going to have to do 450 plus 300. And I know that that's going to be equal to 750. So that's Ben and Stanley combined. And then I need to know how many fewer magazines Debbie had than both Ben and Stanley. I know that Debbie had 600, so now we're going to subtract 700 and 600, or 750 and 600. I know that whenever I have 700 and I take 600 away from that, that leaves me with 100. So when I subtract that from 100, then that leaves me with 50. So the answer for the sentence for how many fewer magazines did Debbie sell than Ben and Stanley, it is Debbie sold 50 fewer magazines than Ben and Stanley combined. So make sure you're getting this written on your paper correctly and you're ready to move on to part D. So question D says, how many more magazines did Debbie and Jeff sell than Ben and Rachel? So this is combining Debbie and Jeff and then Ben and Rachel and then subtracting those two numbers because it says how many more. So I want you to go ahead and find the numbers for Debbie and Jeff, combine them, combine the numbers for Ben and Rachel, and then out of those two numbers that you get, we know that we're going to have to subtract because it says how many more. And then you're going to be ready to answer in a complete sentence. So I want you to work on part D, and whenever you're ready to check your answer, I want you to push play. So when we combine Debbie and Jeff, that's 600 plus 100, and that gave us 700 magazines. When we combined Ben and Rachel, that was 300 plus 250, and that gave us 550 magazines. And to be able to figure out how many more Debbie and Jeff sold than Ben and Rachel, we had to take 700 minus the 550, and that left us with 150. So the correct answer that you should have written in a complete sentence on your paper is Debbie and Jeff sold 150 more magazines than Ben and Rachel sold. Okay, so this time the bar graph has been done for you. Then we've got some questions to answer based on this bar graph. So this bar graph is showing the number of visitors there were at a carnival on Monday through Friday. And when you're looking at the scale, because the scale is always a really good thing to look at first, you see that they're counting by 50s. And you need to know what all of these numbers in between stand for. So if we're going from 300 to 350, then you've got to be thinking, what do these tick marks in between here stand for? Because we're going to need to know that whenever we're looking at some of these bars that are directly on some of these tick marks. So I want you to take a second. I want you to think, what could those tick marks stand for? So that way we know how to read this graph correctly. Okay, so the best way to be able to tell what those tick marks represent is actually to start down here at 0 and to see what could you skip count by on these tick marks to take you to 50. So when we got 0, we could have said 10, 20, 30, 40, and then the next line would have been 50. So in between each one of these numbers, we're skip counting by 10. So at 50, we would go to 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. So let's look at 300. I'm going to go at 300 and I'm going to skip count by tens. After 300, it would be 310, 320, 330, 340, 350. You've got to really pay attention to those tick marks and know that they're counting by tens, and that's going to help you read some of these bars, whereas you can see are on some of these tick marks and they're not directly on a 100 or a 50 that we're counting by. So let's look at the questions. A says, how many fewer visitors were there on the least busy day than on the busiest day? So we're going to have to find the smallest bar and the tallest bar, and we're going to have to find the difference between those two numbers to be able to answer this question. So when you're looking at the bars, I see that the smallest bar is actually Thursday. And I know that we were at 150 right here, so if I'm skip counting by tens, and I go 160, 170, 180, 190, So right here where it says Thursday, I'm actually just going to write 190 so that way I know that's what is meant for Thursday. And then the tallest bar looks like it's Wednesday. We were at 400, so we got 410, 420, 430. So right here for Wednesday, I'm going to write the number 430. So that way I know that I'm going to be working with the numbers 430 and 190 to be able to answer this question. Whenever it says how many fewer, that's very similar to like how many more. So we are going to be subtracting to be able to answer this question. So we're going to subtract 430 and 190. And that's going to give us the answer to this question. And so I want you to subtract those numbers on your paper and then answer this question in a complete sentence. So when you subtracted 430 and 190, you should have gotten 240. So the answer to the question is there were 240 fewer visitors on the least busiest day than the busiest day. Part B says how many more, so you know we're going to be subtracting somewhere in here. How many more visitors attended the carnival on Monday and Tuesday combined than on Thursday and Friday combined? So this is like a three-step problem because we're going to have to combine Monday and Tuesday, and we're going to have to combine Thursday and Friday, and then we know that we're going to have to subtract those two numbers to actually be able to answer this question. So go ahead and combine Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, and then write your subtraction number sentence to be able to answer this question. And whenever you're ready to check it, you may push play. Okay, so when you combine Monday and Tuesday, you should have added 340 and 300, and that would have given you 640. When you combine Thursday and Friday, you should have added 190 for Thursday and 370 for Friday, and that gave you 560. So when you subtracted 640 from 560, that left you with 80. So the answer to the question of how many more visitors were at the carnival on Monday and Tuesday than on Thursday and Friday is there were 80 more visitors on Monday and Tuesday than there were on Thursday and Friday. So you're ready to move to the exit ticket. You're going to need to look at the scale, make sure you know exactly what those numbers are, and then you're going to answer the questions that go along with the graph. When you're ready to check your exit ticket, bring it to me.